work towards. And unfortunately, we've had an increase in commitments and actions, but until now, none of those biodiversity targets have been met. And so this is why this year is so incredibly important, because we've got the COP15, the virtual event this year, the more physical event early next year. And this is when leaders are coming together to really discuss, how can we set strategies and ambitions to help tackle this biodiversity crisis, because we're finding ourselves, as you know, in the middle of a sixth mass species extinction. And while in the past, this was really related to natural events, so volcanic eruptions or a meteor falling from space, the root cause of the mass extinction that we have today is linked to our economy. So the economy of today is extremely extractive, it's wasteful, and it's polluting. It's what we call a linear take, make, waste economy, where we extract resources from the ground to make products we only use for a very short period of time, and then we throw them away in landfill, incineration, or in the environment. So that is becoming problematic because our economy is now extracting more resources than our planet can replenish. And this extractive and wasteful way in which we manage our resources is now responsible for more than 90% of global biodiversity loss. And so this is, I guess, the global story in terms of the issues around biodiversity. Now, in terms of what this means for Africa, what's interesting is the differences between the discussions in the global north versus the global south. In the global north, it's really about, a lot of the biodiversity has been lost. So the question is really, how do we bring back biodiversity? But in the global south, there's still a lot of biodiversity-rich areas. The discussion is, how do we safeguard that biodiversity? And in Africa, Africa as a continent has about 1/5 of all the species of mammals, birds, and plants. And that's tremendous. It also has this huge variation in ecosystems. We've got the deserts, the tropical forests, the mangroves, the grasslands, the savannas, right? And that's quite interesting also from an ecosystem perspective. And then more than 62% of the population in Africa is dependent on biodiversity because we need it for food, for shelter, for medicine, for health, for energy, right? And also to generate our revenues. So biodiversity is incredibly important. Before, we've always seen it as this separate thing to our economy, but the two are heavily interlinked. We can't have a prosperous life without biodiversity. And so, and if you look at the world as a whole, more than half of global GDP depends on well-functioning ecosystems. So this is, I think, important to see the economy as also dependent on biodiversity. Sorry, I can't hear you, Reinera. I think you're muted.
That's because it's 2021 and I've only done this a million times and I forgot to push my mute button. So, okay, so, how do we halt this and how do we reverse global biodiversity loss? And where explicitly does circular economy come into play?
So that's why we're all gathering. So I'm going to share my slides just to guide the conversation a little bit. So just wait for a second. I hope you can all see my slides. Can you see them?
Yes, it's great.
Yes. Amazing. So what do? We have this global crisis. How can the circular economy help? Well, first of all, scientific organizations like the IPBES, they've been stressing that if we're going to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, we need transformative change. So this is transformative change in our economic, social, political, and technological systems. And what's being stressed is that we need conservation and restoration efforts are absolutely critical in our fight against biodiversity loss. So what you see here is this the blue line is the business as usual if you don't do anything. In green, you see the impact of conservation and restoration efforts. We've seen what we've seen is that targets are being set. Around 30% of land and oceans have been said that we should protect those. The United Nations has also declared the decade on restoration. So these are very important in helping us restore biodiversity. But what's also being said is that on top of that, what we also need is transformative change in our production and consumption systems that underpin our economy, because that part of the story currently is responsible for more than 90% of global biodiversity loss. And if we can transform that in such a way that we can both safeguard and rebuild biodiversity, we can help bend that curve of biodiversity loss. And this is exactly where the circular economy can play a key role. And this is what our recently launched study really goes into a bit more detail, is that the circular economy can help by really rethinking how our economy works. So think about the chemicals, the products, the buildings, your clothes, how we grow our food, how we design cities. How do we rethink? We can both at the same time safeguard and rebuild biodiversity. And the circular economy is really based on three key principles: eliminate waste and pollution, which can help reduce threats to biodiversity. And we've got also circulate products and materials, which can help us leave room for biodiversity. And the third principle is regenerate nature to help biodiversity thrive. So those are the three main principles that can play a key role here.
So, okay, so we've got these three key principles, which are eliminate waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate nature. And I feel like regeneration nature kind of, I can get that, but can you just talk us through how do these principles and biodiversity act together? What's the connection there?
Yeah, and I think maybe the easiest way is for me to provide a few concrete examples for each of them. So I'm just going to go one by one. So for example, for eliminate waste and pollution, the problem that we have, and I'm going to just use plastic packaging as an example. Today, we are dumping one garbage truck of plastic into the ocean every minute. And if we don't do anything, we'll have more plastic than fish in our oceans by 2050. So that's a huge problem. And of course, has a significant impact on biodiversity. But if we apply the first principle of the circular economy, eliminate waste and pollution, then the question is, how can we redesign our plastic packaging in such a way that from the start, that packaging never becomes waste in the first place? So you have to think of innovations like designing edible cutlery or bowls, or dissolvable sachets, or, for example, designing products that do not need plastic packaging. So these are just examples of innovations that allow you to eliminate waste and pollution. And here I've just illustrated on this slide 2 examples. You have this one startup in South Africa called Munch Bowls. They have designed these biodegradable but also edible bowls that you can just eat, and they're made out of flour, and they have some rooibos extract, and they have a shelf life of 15 months. But this is a way of avoiding single-use plastic, and also type of product that also has nutritional value. On the right-hand side, you have an example, Evoware, which is in Indonesia. And here, I don't know if you've come across, but sometimes these type of noodle boxes, they have these sachets with sauces in there, or for soups, or in salads, you've got these small sachets, which are single-use. So they're finding these types of innovations that you can make these sachets out of seaweed, which is generating new jobs in the local communities, but it's also offering this alternative that avoids plastic packaging. And later on, we will hear about Sonke, when we have Eben on the call today, and he's going to talk about his refill innovation and why this can contribute quite positively in our fight against biodiversity. So these are examples of the first principle. The second principle of the circular economy is to circulate products and materials. And here I thought I'd give fashion as an example. Fashion has been projected to demand 35% more land by 2030 globally, to be able to grow cotton fibers, but also for livestock, or leather, for example. And that extra land leads to habitat degradation, fragmentation, and just habitat destruction. So the question from a circular economy perspective is, how can we rethink how we use our clothes? Are there business models like rental, reshare, resale, reuse that we can employ to increase the lifetime of our clothes so that we don't have to extract more resources? So if you look at your cotton t-shirts, if we could increase the lifetime by twice as long, we would be able to halve the amount of land needed to grow that cotton. And that would mean we would be able to have more land available for the preservation of wildlife. So this is like the benefit of finding business models that increase the use and utilization of our clothes and assets and materials. And here I just have an example from South Africa again. It's called Style Rotate. It's a company that offers designer clothes, but they rent it. So instead of selling it to you, they rent it, and they give this 4-day rental period. And the idea is that you move away a little bit from that ownership model towards more of a usage model, but it also brings this element of accessibility. Clothes that would be way too expensive is now more accessible because you can just rent it. So this is, of course, more of a niche type of example, but it's a good illustration. The last example I have here is on the third principle. And for some reason, I can't move to the next slide. Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you, Soukeyna, but I've not.
Okay. All right, here we go. The last slide is on regenerate nature. This is, of course, really important in the discussion that we have today about how to safeguard biodiversity, because if we look at food, the food sector, it is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss globally. So if we're going to tackle the biodiversity crisis, food is a big part of that discussion. And the way we grow our food today, we have a lot of monocultures, systems that extract resources. We tend to release a lot of chemicals, and we strip local biodiversity. So from a circular economy perspective, the question is, how can we rethink how we grow our food in such a way that we allow biodiversity to thrive? So can we employ practices that create healthy soils, that bring nutrients back into the soil, that stimulate not only soil biodiversity, but also above ground biodiversity, that also stimulate the ground to soak carbon from the atmosphere. So to show the benefits of this, we have a film from this Tamulu regenerative farm in Kenya. So I'm just going to stop sharing and show you this 1-minute video about regenerative farming.
Ash, I'm hoping you're standing by to push play.
Yes, ma'am.
Did I stop sharing or not?
No, we can still see your screen.
Okay, here we go. All right, Ashik, when you're ready.
Farmers in Africa are important to the economy, but also very exposed to climate change. Regenerative agriculture is farming practices that bring back destroyed soil in a way that makes soil healthy and productive, restores biodiversity, and improves the nutrition. That's the future.
What we're standing in here are actually tunnels that used to grow flowers, and only 2 years ago it was just bush, lots of weeds, very overgrown and not much life. We decided to set up agroforestry because we wanted a food production system that produces superior quality, enhances soil and sequesters as much carbon as possible, and enhances, of course, biodiversity. It was really when we first went to Brazil and discovered the advantages of syntropic agroforestry over any other agroforestry, we realized a lot of the crops that they were using in Brazil are also in Africa. And so we knew we could do it here and just slightly change it ever so slightly just to fit into the local context.
As chefs, it's our duty to source our food from producers who are really looking after the environment. And I can tell you from a chef's point of view, this is where it starts. This is where you start building flavor. And more you'll see customers push back and actually demand that their food comes from responsible sources.
The future has got food and feed for everyone. We should not just think about ourselves. We are part of nature. We need to have a stable agricultural system in which we're able to store a lot of carbon in the soil to produce healthy food for human beings and other parts of the ecosystem, and therefore get on a path of growth that is based on the wider concept of circular economy.
So yeah, these were examples that we've just shared to help illustrate how the circular economy can play a role and how each of these principles can have a positive impact on biodiversity, and how it's important to, it's about transforming the economy really to be regenerative by design. So I'm hoping these examples help illustrate the potential.
Thanks.
Right. Okay.
Soukeyna, sorry. We can put the links up to, there are another 5 videos that really show a lot more about regenerative farming in East Africa. But I'd like to bring in Eben and invite Eben to join our conversation. So Eben is the founder of a company called Sonke. And as Soukeyna alluded to earlier, that is about a refill and reuse system. So Eben, can you just share with us what Sonke is all about?
Sure. So it makes a lot more sense if I take you through some slides. Otherwise, it becomes quite a conceptual conversation. So just let me know when you guys can see my screen.
We can see your screen.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Sonke is a Zulu word. It means all of us. And yeah, I hope to show you why it's called that in the next couple of slides. So Sonke was started with a very specific problem in mind, and that is that the poorest people end up paying more for their consumer goods than the wealthy people do, firstly. And they also generate a lot more waste. So a nice way to kind of illustrate this is the different pack sizes of Sunlight. So this is the market leader in terms of dishwash in South Africa. But you can take this and apply it to any FMCG category. So if you're buying this bulk 5-litre pack, you're paying around 32 Rand a litre. If you're buying the 750 pack, you're paying 40 Rand a litre. And if you're buying the 100 ml sachet, you're spending about 50 Rand a litre. So the price increase goes up to 56% for the smaller pack sizes. And that generates 2,400% more waste in terms of number of pieces of packaging. And I just think that's a crazy model that we've ended up with. And I think there's space to improve this, firstly, for consumers. And I think for businesses, especially in the tourism industry, it's the same, right? So you don't want to be overpaying for things. So I think that's this can kind of be applied to business owners as well. So what do? We design, manufacture, and manage automated refill stations for fast-moving consumer goods at the moment, but also looking at use cases in other industries. So, for example, engine oil is I think an easy target for us, and we can chat about that in the next couple of slides. So, how does it work? You select your product and your size. You press start, we fill the bottle, we print a barcoded slip. So we have a stock control measure in that, and you pay at the till point. So that's how it works. But yeah, this can be adapted for any type of industry, which I think we can chat about now.
No, absolutely. And I was going to ask you exactly that. So I think at the moment you're looking at dishwasher liquid, and you're probably looking at fabric softener from the pictures on your screens, and something else in an orange bucket. But what is the connection here into conservation, the environment, stopping biodiversity loss? How is your system able to help with that?
Yeah, so I think it all comes into trying to be as efficient as possible and keeping plastics out of the environment, right? So plastics cost money, and if you've got a solution around that, you can apply that to any industry. And it needs to be something that's not only focused on the environmental good, because you need that economic side as well. And our solution offers that. Yeah. Okay,
so kind of, I know you've had a bit of a think about this, but at the moment, you have your refill stations in shops, and it has a kind of small group of products that you're looking at. In terms of the conservation and ecotourism sector, what opportunities can you see for refill and reuse in the sector?
Yeah, so I think the main target would be water. I think bottled water is probably the most destructive, I think, industry from a plastics point of view, where the value of that water versus the value of the packaging is just not in relation. I think that we currently have a bit of an acceptability challenge around refill, because you don't really want to offer clients just a tap to go refills. And I think we can offer something really appealing that has a journey and a customer journey that I think people would find acceptable. So that's on the customer facing side, or I think front of house. And I think back of house, we can offer solutions linked to stock control. So by instituting a machine like this, we can also link consumption to a person. So if you have a high value liquid, for example, a lubricant for your vehicles, that there is a massive saving by going to bulk, and that should justify the capital expenditure. Yeah, so shampoos, it's another option for back of house. Cooking oil, I think, is a great one, where the benefit of going bulk would also be able to justify the capital expenditure.
I mean, I think it's really exciting, and I think there are, like you say, lots of opportunities. We're actually looking at refill and reuse across a vast range of different products that the ecotourism sector uses. We have the ability to not only drive plastic out of the environment because we're eliminating the need for single-use plastic, we're kind of keeping the plastic that you are using in use, so we're keeping kind of products and materials in use. But also, I think what's really interesting about what you're saying is that it starts to provide it at a price point that then becomes more acceptable to those users who sometimes wouldn't be able to accept it. So I think thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's a really great, I think, food for thought, really, about how we could introduce reuse and refill within an ecotourism sector and help drive plastic out of the economy and all the other benefits. So I think we're gonna open up to the floor now, and I know we had a couple of questions which we wanted to ask people. So if people could put their fingers over their keyboards, and it would be really useful to understand what sector everybody works in. So where are you kind of dialing in from? What do you do? And what are the biggest threats to biodiversity that you are facing? I think that would be really interesting for us to hear about. So if people could put that in the chat, that would be amazing. Education, yes, Art, I know where you're from. Water level rising, okay, yeah. We have that problem too here on this tiny island where Soukeyna and I are living.
So there was a question about the accessibility for the poor.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've trialed our machines in both high income and low income market segments, and we found that it works much better in the lower end, where the price point or the cost saving is a much better motivator than the green benefit that a higher income consumer gets. So we're definitely more focused on the lower end, on the social and the environmental impact, where people really need it, versus what I like to say is a housewife that wants to feel better about themselves. I think we're definitely more focused on the other end of the spectrum.
Cool. Another question which we thought might be really interesting to get the answer to is, if we think back to the 3 principles that Soukey talked about in terms of eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products and resources, and regenerating nature, in terms of the world of, or the business of conservation, where do people in the audience see the most exciting or promising opportunities? It would be really interesting to either put that in the chat, or if you feel brave enough, let's see if I can spot people with their hands up, and we'll turn your cameras on, and you can share with us. So where would you see, having listened to what you've listened to, where do you see the most exciting opportunities for introducing the 3 principles of the circular economy? Either in the chat or raise your hand. It's like tumbleweed out there. Colin, thank you.
I got my hand up. Thanks, guys. This is really fascinating to listen to the experts. So from a biodiversity and circular economy perspective, it's fascinating to understand what the market is starting to appreciate in terms of the value of biodiversity. And looking at European Central Bank, for example, coming out with their supervisory regulations in June, saying that they have to, all the banks need to price in climate risk and natural risk, they call it, which is biodiversity risk. And it's in terms of traditional banking measurements. So it's Basel capital reserving requirements, and fundamentally comes in a credit risk. The problem that I'm finding is that measurement of biodiversity is not well understood, and the way that people are going about it is not common. I think UNEP's come up with 14 different biodiversity measurements, 7 for commercial and 7 for non-commercial. And I think the challenge is understanding or getting the market to understand what are we actually trying to do here. And we are looking at an equity fund. We've partnered with an equity fund in London, and they are targeting listed equities in the circular economy, you know, plastic production, new technologies. So there's pure play in there. And in addition, there's supply chain angles. The fund is now having to demonstrate to its investors that is a legitimate biodiversity restoration fund. How do you do that? How do you measure that? And if you can objectively measure that, you can actually make the sale to the investors much more clear, and they will be much more prepared to invest in it if there is a common understanding in the market, just like usual market dynamics. So that to me is really, I'd love to hear your panel's opinion on how that is going to be addressed.
I can say something. I'm definitely no expert in the finance world, but I do definitely what you're saying really resonates because it's incredibly important, of course. And this issue is quite different than to climate change, where we have this 1.5 degree target, and therefore we're all, you know where we need to be. Whereas with biodiversity, it's so complex and so difficult to really, we can't really put a number to it, and that's what makes the whole thing super complex. And there are so many different ways of measuring biodiversity. Biodiversity in itself, genetic, species, ecosystems, functionality, but then also from a business perspective, where you're looking at your impact from a product, from a business, from a supply chain perspective. There's different type of metrics that makes it just all together more complex. But what is, I guess, a bit more promising, I'd say, is the science-based targets for nature. We have the science-based targets for climate, which has done quite well. And now there's considerable effort to get the science-based targets for nature, and this is being done in I guess, together with businesses. So I'm hoping that will help pave the way. I know there's some guidances being published already for those businesses to help them set these targets, and hopefully that can help the conversation as to where we need to be. How can you set those targets? How do you also measure and report on your progress? I'm hoping. And from a circular economy perspective is then, how does the circular economy within your company, how is that helping you actually reach those targets, which is another thing, because not everybody is able to see the link between the circular economy and biodiversity. So making that link is helpful as well.
Yeah. I think from my side, I think it does make it a much easier conversation if you can measure the impact. So for me, it becomes a very easy conversation with a big corporate when we can quantify the percentage saving for consumers, and then also the environmental impact in terms of the amount of plastic that we diverting from landfill. So you're spot on, agree with the sentiment, although in a slightly different space, I think, than to what you're referring to.
Thanks, guys. Robert, you've made a comment talking about biodiversity offset market to rival the carbon offset market. Do you want to say anything else about that, or do either Eben or Soukeyna want to come back on that?
Yeah, not my area of expertise.
That was actually me. I am Robert. I've managed to come in on my work colleague's login link from Conservation. So I'm Melanie Spark, actually, an investment officer with Conservation International, the conservation finance team in Africa, or CFD Africa. So that's where it comes from.
Cool.
Thanks for your comment. But yeah, it is quite, we were mentioning rewarding government restoration initiatives and regenerative farming practices, and especially that, I guess, that we talk a lot about the role of regeneration being quite key. But yeah, setting the conditions for success for those farmers is super important. And as the policymakers and finance institutions, we all have a role to play there, also businesses, in creating that enabling environment so that we can get more products off the market that have that positive impact on biodiversity. And so there's quite a bit of work to do to help scale that part of the market.
I think I just have a quick follow-up question on that, if anybody can answer what you've seen, because the biggest drive for the carbon offset market has obviously been at a intergovernmental level from a regulatory and policy push. Are we seeing any kind of that indication for biodiversity that is starting to happen now? Or is there just not quite the same impetus because there isn't the link to, or the direct link to climate change?
Sorry, it's not exactly my area of expertise, but I imagine it's going to become more and more important because, you know, there's a lot of focus on climate, but actually biodiversity is probably a even bigger issue than climate. So what you're seeing is that more and more, at least what I've been seeing, is that more and more research is being done in the discussion about setting the financial incentives and getting this discussion about how do we measure it and how do we make sure we can help safeguard biodiversity. You see more attention around that going, but it's unfortunately not my area of expertise.
And we're about to go. So thank
Realizing that I was on mute, let me try that again. On that note, welcome back, everybody. Yeah, man, this brings us to the end of our day one of BCC. It's been quite an eventful day, I have to say. We've learned a lot, we've moved. Have you ever been to a conference where you come to the conference and you're asked to leave the conference? You leave the conference completely and then you're asked to come back again, right? That's how eventful this today was. But again, that's the joys of technology and working with it. But you know, every good thing must come to an end, and we must put things together. So as we end the day today, I'm going to ask us all